Well, I see there's no mic here, so the situation is actually pretty relaxed, and I hope you can hear me all pretty well. Right? Хорошо. Okay. I'm happy to today to introduce Ivana Picte as part of our distinguished lecture series. And of course, Mr. Picte has many facets in his life and long-standing illustrious career. Let me start with the non-historical one, which is his business side. Of course, by education, as many of us, he took his first degree in economics in St. Gallen, and then at the School of Business Administration. After that, as he modestly confesses, he mostly abandoned science and went into practical business, having become one of the most successful private equity specialists in Swiss business. But of course, it might have been explained, or it might have been actually made difficult by the fact that Mr. Picte represents the 8th generation of the family company, which is the famous bank called Picte. And I can't imagine what kind of a burden hangs on your shoulders when you assume leadership in a company which 7 generations of your your relatives tried to rule and develop. So Mr. Picte served as a senior managing partner of Bank Picte from 2005 to 2010, and had an overall responsibility for the activities of this bank, including regional development of Eastern Europe and the CIS countries. So if you ever wanted to see a famous Swiss bank represented, where allegedly, of course, many of our Russian competitors would go to invest in the most successful way, of course, you can take a look at Mr. Picte. Hopefully I'm not exaggerating their share in the business of the Picte Group, which is itself, of course, a Swiss multinational private bank and financial services company. It's headquartered in Geneva, that's where we met for the first time, and it's one of the largest Swiss banks in the world. Wealth management is primarily its main specialization, and I'm happy to see many of our economists here. I also was pleased to hear that Mr. Picte is holding the place of the company which manages Peugeot Citroën, which is PSI International. He is the chairman of the board of directors, and what I can read on the internet, that this position includes being in charge of market risks management, that is exchange, interest rates, and commodities. Now let me transfer to the charitable part, or to other roles. I think that, of course, coming from a family which has a long-standing interest in development of the city of Geneva, it's not surprising that Mr. Picte is the president of the Fondation pour Genève, which aims at promoting Geneva as an international cooperation center. At some point, he was the head of the center which tried transforming Geneva into the world financial center, which I would say is 20 times easier than what our colleagues in Moscow tried to do with Moscow. At some point, they had the thing which is not as successful. He, of course, is also a founder of Picte Charitable Foundation, and the founder of Prix Picte, which is the world's leading award for photography and sustainability. There's also a family art collection, which is called Picte Art Collection, which contains about 800 Swiss artworks, specifically concentrating on Swiss art. And for our economists, it might be also interesting that he has established at some point a chair in finance and development at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. Now, I would like to say that when we first met, actually it was not the finance side or the charitable side which brought us together. It was a visit of the chair of our board of trustees and the director of the Hermitage Museum, Mikhail Piotrovsky, to Geneva, where I accompanied him. And I gave a talk linked to the work of our Res Publica Center. And at the time we had a question of how does Republican Morris of Geneva, where so many people could proudly call themselves les citoyens de Genève, as Rousseau did, and I guess a part of Pictet family did, how does it square today with the successes of the Swiss model of living together? I would better call it in a Republican way rather than democratic way, but Monsieur Pictet has taken our invitation and challenge to come over and to talk about the Swiss model, is it applicable to other countries, and to reflect a little bit also on the business background of the family Pictet together. So without further ado, I pass the floor to Ivan Pictet. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Rector and Professor, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, I'm very honored to be obviously here in this distinguished university and also in this beautiful city of St. Petersburg, which I've visited several times. I gather every body understands English. I hope you'll understand me. The subject, of course, today is not necessarily my company or my former company, because I'm retired now for 8 years and I do other things than banking. But it's to speak about the Swiss model. And I won't bore you too long with just sort of explaining the Swiss model, but I would like to put it in the perspective of what is happening today in Europe, in the European Union, with the Brexit, with other problems of institutional developments in the EU, and show you maybe that the Swiss model, which has been, one must admit, very successful. Switzerland is a very prosperous country, as you know. It has half the unemployment rate of the European Union. It has a huge trade surplus, in spite of the fact that 50% of its economy depends on exports. Its GDP depends on exports. With the hardest currency in the world, so that's quite a performance. How is that achieved? Obviously, there are only two ways: through productivity and innovation. So I think we have a country which obviously has done well and is in a very strong situation. But I will also, after giving you a little more details about the system in Switzerland, touch about the challenges, because you will see that obviously we're facing major challenges, maybe some of the most important challenges that we've ever had in the country. And now, is our model applicable to other countries? That will be the sort of conclusive part of this part on Switzerland. Obviously, I can tell you immediately the question is no. The answer is no, so you don't have to have big expectations. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the Pictet Bank with its 15 years of private ownership. Now let's start with Switzerland. So, as I said, nobody can deny that we have a prosperous country, though you must realize that Switzerland has been very poor during a very long time. And even if you take one of the last part of Switzerland that joined, I will come back to that later, Geneva in 1815, we were one of the last cantons joining Switzerland, the before last canton. In the early 1900s, Geneva was one of the poorest cities in Europe. It was poorer than Lisbon, for instance, in Portugal. And therefore, because it has no industry, it's a small city, it's surrounded by France. You know, you are in 5 minutes walk or by car from the center of Geneva to 95% of its borders, which is France. So there's no way to expand. Therefore, we are a vertical city, if you like, almost an intellectual city. That's a little bit pretentious, but we are not a... so in fact, the wealth of Geneva came only, I would say, after the Second World War. The fact that obviously Switzerland was not, had no wars, did not go into the two world wars, was a huge advantage, which was basically responsible for its present prosperity. But the big development in the Swiss and in the Geneva economy was in the 1980s, and since then also in the years 2000. Just to show you the strength of the Swiss franc and the fact that when your economy depends 50% on exports, you have to be pretty good in terms of productivity. When I was a kid, sterling was at 12 francs. Today it's 1 franc 25. It means that sterling has declined 90% since then. Of course, you could say that it's a long time ago that I was a kid. But when I started in the US working 50 years ago, Morgan Stanley, the dollar was 44 francs 32. It's less than 1 franc today, meaning that it's lost 80% of its value. So that is just to show you that in spite of being a strong currency, a little bit with the same example as Japan, in fact, we've maintained low unemployment and strong trade balance and very solid accounts. So I think productivity again and innovation are key to this association, to this success. The World Economic Forum and the IMD in Lausanne Graduate Institute have each a competitive report every year, and since they exist, those competitive reports show Switzerland as being either number 1 or number 2 in terms of productivity in the OECD countries. So that's a very flattering, I would say, that's a very flattering reflection of what Switzerland is today, because it might not be maybe as good in the future. So that's all for my sales pitch on Switzerland. But I think you have to understand a little bit the political system that prevails in Switzerland, which has helped achieve this result. You have to go back 720 years ago when 3 little forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz and Unterwald, decided to make an alliance against the Germanic Roman Empire, at that time the Habsburgs. And of course they were very small cantons, and the Habsburgs were a big power, but the Swiss, the 3 Swiss cantons which started Switzerland, in fact, they were poor, they only had forests, they had very little agriculture, the land was very poor also, they had no minerals, nothing. The only thing they were good soldiers. They were, bûcherons, I don't know what you call it in English, but they were cutting trees the whole day, so of course they had big muscle. And they were excellent, and in fact the then joined 5, 6, 7, 8 cantons until 1515. It was more than 200 years later, and that was the first time, and during that period of time there were lots of wars between the Swiss and their neighbors, the French, Burgundy, the Germanic Empire, and the Swiss each time won all those battles. They were the best army in Europe. Why? Because they were, as I said before, those sort of forest guys, very tough and very eager to defend their little territory. So that's how Switzerland sort of started with a system where each canton remained totally independent, sovereign, but just signed an alliance system where they would help themselves in case one of the cantons was being attacked. That was the only thing that how Switzerland was born. In fact, it was just an agreement of assistance in case of being aggressed by other countries. And there was a ruling canton which was moving around every 2 years, the Diet. So in fact there was no one canton ruling the others, but it was changing all the time. You will see why it's important, because it's still very strongly sort of part of the Swiss system. So if you look at this first slide, you'll see that we have 26 cantons today. Geneva, as I said before, was the before last one to join in 1815. And now how did this sort of 26 cantons survive until 1948, when in fact the first construction of Switzerland happened by a constitution and by a city, Bern, being named as the official city of Switzerland. It's not the capital, but it's the official city of the Federation, of the Confederation of Switzerland. Well, as I said before, they were unbeaten until 1515. You might wonder why the French who defeated, it was François Ier who defeated the Swiss in 1515, why they didn't stay in Switzerland. Because obviously the cantons were holding the Alps. The Alps were extremely important. That was the only asset of those cantons. They were holding the passage through the Alps, and of course all the trade between the northern part and the southern part, mostly between the southern part and the northern part of Europe, in fact, had to go through them. So the French were very clever. Instead of occupying the country, which they would have found difficulties, like maybe today in some of the Middle Eastern countries, they retreated from the conquered territories immediately, and they signed a perpetual freedom between the Swiss and the French. So the reaction was to beat them, but to leave them immediately, to keep them sort of controlling the Alps, which was absolutely crucial. I think that was really one of the very strong things that made Switzerland. And the Swiss, of course, were the best mercenaries. You know that all the armies since the big powers started in the 12th, 13th century had no locals in their armies. They were only using mercenaries, and the Germans and the Swiss were the best mercenaries. In fact, the last mercenaries died at the French Revolution. Louis XVI in the Tuileries lost his throne by the French Revolution. He was defended by a Swiss battalion that was his only guard. They all got killed, and he was taken in prison and then put to death. Today you still have the only mercenaries existing still, the Swiss mercenaries, are in the Vatican. If you go to Rome and you go and see the Vatican and the Pope has 150 Swiss soldiers sort of protecting him. The Italian police is not allowed into the Vatican, and they still have their armor and their old costumes, but under the armor, I can tell you because I visited the Vatican several times, although I'm Protestant and obviously not very close to the Pope, but the Swiss guards have guns and very modern weapons hidden behind their armor, and so they are very well equipped to protect the Pope. Until 1815, until Geneva joined with the Valais and a third canton, Neuchâtel, Switzerland showed a very slow integration, and that's what makes the strength of this country. It's the fact that every piece of it has accepted to join and has had a long time to integrate, I think Switzerland was also able to get away from the religious wars that tore apart Europe in the 16th and 17th century, although there were lots of tensions because the biggest cantons like Bern, Zurich, Basel, Geneva are Protestant, and most of the other cantons are Catholic, but the majority of the country is Protestant. There was one civil war, so 1515 was the first defeat against the French, and then the second war in Switzerland was in 1847, when there was a civil war between the Catholic and the Protestant canton, which of course the Protestants won because they had the majority, and the general who was named was from Geneva, General Dufour. The war lasted 1 month, and there were less than 100 casualties, so I don't think it's going to be in the international textbooks of the major wars in Europe, but it shows that obviously there is still today a very big difference between cantons being Catholic or Protestant. Geneva is very Protestant, as you will see maybe afterwards when I speak about the banking system. I think if you, I don't know whether it's on the next slide. No, it's not on the next slide. But anyway, to illustrate, yes, maybe the next slide, to illustrate the sovereign status of each canton, the important thing is that the federal state today only gets the indirect taxes, and that the cantons are getting 90% of all the direct taxes, corporate tax and personal income taxes. And that's very important in the sense that altogether the tax revenues is about 1/3 going to the Swiss Confederation and 2/3 going to the cantons and the commune. So you see your taxes, and you will see the taxes are very high. In fact, a wealthy executive from a company or whatever, a wealthy individual in Switzerland would pay about 45% direct income tax on his income, plus 1% on his wealth, on his fortune tax, wealth tax. So you can see that we are one of the sort of high taxed country in Europe, and that's also to break a sort of thinking that Switzerland is a tax haven. it is absolutely not true, in the sense that our tax revenues are extremely high globally. Now they are very steep. 1/3 of the Swiss don't pay any taxes, and all the taxes are paid by the highest income. So that has also created a solidarity in the country where there are less differences and maybe less tensions between the less favored and the most favored. So it's very important to see that, you know, if you're taxed 50% or something like that, and when you're retired like me, you pay 70% taxes. So on whatever income is left, but you see where the money goes. I mean, it's about 2/3 in your canton, 1/3 in your commune. I live in a commune with 2,000 inhabitants, and 1/3 of my taxes go to that commune. So you are really you see, you know, when the road is being redone in front of your house, you know where the money comes from, and that's something which is absolutely unique in Europe. Nowhere everything goes through a central government system and then is paid back to the regions with all the problems. In Switzerland, you are very close to where your money is.
I just looked through the presentation pages, and what you're saying is actually extremely interesting. It's just that it's not reflected on the slide.
No,
So
we're going to the second slide now.
Yeah. What is there is the structure.
Yeah,
of the
we
federal
have
government.
now 7 ministers in the government. Very. I'll be a bit quicker maybe. They are elected for 4 years, and every year they change. One of them becomes president, keeps his ministry, but becomes president on top of that with representation and so on. And if you ask today, about 2/3 of the people in Switzerland, I would guess, would not know who the president is. And that's something I think unique. I don't know of any other country which would not be able to name his president, certainly not this one. And and the ministers stay until they leave. I mean, they are re-elected, but automatically. And they represent exactly the 4 biggest parties in parliament. And they are elected by the parliament. So you don't have any populism or any sort of direct democratic election of our executives. They are elected by the parliament, and the parliament respects the proportionality of those 7 ministers by giving there. You know, if the far right minister resigns, he's replaced by somebody from his party, and all the other parties will vote for one of. They will not try to get his seat. I mean, the system is based on a clear representation of all the parties. But you will see that, and of course, the fact that nobody knows who the president is, it makes them very low key. I mean, you will see, there was something on the social media last year where you saw the president, Burkhalter, 2 years ago, taking his train at the Bern train station. He was alone on the quay, waiting for the train. There was no bodyguard, and he was there in the middle of the crowd, and nobody recognized him. In fact, and he was the president of the country. Women play a big role. We have 3 women out of 7 ministers. We had 4, in fact, during a certain period of time. The men got the voting right in Switzerland in 1848, but the women had to wait until 1971 to get voting rights. So we are catching up very quickly. Now there's about 30% women in parliament, and we have 3 out of 7 ministers which are women. So I think that's for now. Maybe slide 4. Maybe they can leave
Here's about the ladies on that slide.
Well, that's the parties. The problem is today that we have a new party which is a nationalistic far-right party. That's unfortunately the result that you see in many countries because of the migration problems, because of the polarization problem. So the moderate countries in the center, which have always been ruling the country and are still in majority, are losing ground a little bit, and I would say quite a lot in the last 10 years, and especially in the last 3 or 4 years. If you put the next slide, that's of course the biggest thing, the referendum system. You know, 1/3 of all the referendums that have been adopted in the world, that have been in any country, are in Switzerland. So we are the real specialists of referendums. We vote about 20 times a year in the country, 4 times on an average of 5 different topics. Just to give you an example, we voted last time in November. There were 4, I think, topics. One of them was on a major constitutional aspect. The other one was on whether the Swiss accepted to cut off the horns of the cows. And that was that even the peasants in Switzerland did not agree on whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. It would have cost a few hundred million Swiss francs to cut them all off, but it would have kept, of course, the herd more because they were hurting themselves with their horns by fighting and so on. So that was, you see the kind of issue, we go from one extreme to the other, and that of course is a good thing, but it's a bad thing at the same time, because people don't really make the difference between what is essential and what is not essential. Now, of course, the referendum system has been one of the big question mark about the future of Switzerland, because in 2014 there was an initiative which requires 100,000 votes, a referendum only 50,000 votes, was voted, presented by the far-right party, which is against migration, and the socialists, which are against the dumping of salaries in Switzerland by migration. And it was accepted by 50.3% of the population, so very, very close. And that was to limit migration of people from the EU. And that was, of course, the trigger of major problems we have today with the EU, because there is a clause, and you will see the system with the EU, there is a clause that if we break any of our agreements with the EU, all the others are automatically caduc. I mean, they have to be renegotiated. So that was the first big blow to our very special alliance with the European Union, where we still were able to remain sovereign by having a lot of advantages being in Europe. Europe is a 500 million consumer region, and Switzerland is right in the middle. We cannot avoid being close to Europe and having agreements. So maybe the next one. Switzerland is neutral, of course, as you know, since 1815. There, a little page of history. The Swiss, Napoleon was defeated. The big powers met in Vienna, the Congress of Vienna. It lasted 1 year and a half. And thanks to the Swiss delegation was headed by Charles Picte, one of my ancestors, who knew the foreign minister of Russia, the Duke of Richelieu, He was a Frenchman, and strangely enough, at that time you see that ministers did not necessarily have the same nationality. And he, of course, had a lot of influence on Alexander, the Tsar Alexander, who was also in Vienna. And in fact, thanks to Alexander, Switzerland, at least in a great deal thanks to Alexander, Switzerland got its neutrality status, plus territories which are still those that we have today. So we owe the Russians quite a lot. But Switzerland is neutral, also recognized by the big powers, therefore. Sweden, for instance, is a neutral country, but is a self-declared neutral country, which is not the same. We are recognized by the powers, and therefore it's a stronger status of neutrality. And we are still used as mediators in many situations. We are representing the US in Iran, for instance, and vice versa. And we are representing Russia in Georgia, and vice versa. And in many other occasions, Switzerland is a mediator when there are no diplomatic ties. Now, what happened with in 2014 when we voted by 50.3% against free movement of people between the EU and Switzerland? That was the beginning of major problems that we are facing now. As I said before, 60% of our trade is with Europe, which represents 1/3 of our GDP. And we're also in the Schengen, of course, zone, which is very important for us. Now, in fact, the Swiss relation with Europe stands on 100 bilateral agreements which have been, during 15 years, one after the other, sort of signed. So it's a very delicate system. We're the only country which has such a system with the European Union. And as I said, the free movement of people is one of the most crucial ones. The fact of having breached that is threatening, in fact, yes, the whole agreement we have with Europe. And in fact, there was only one thing that we never got, and that was the service industry, and especially the financial sector, which is 8% of GDP in Switzerland, which is very strong, never had access to Europe. So we have to have subsidiaries in European countries to be able to bank with them. Otherwise, we cannot do it out of Switzerland. Customers had to come to Switzerland to have banking relations with our banks, but we could not visit them abroad in Europe. So access to the European Union unique market, the unique license, has never been given to Switzerland, and we've been trying desperately to have it. Now, of course, there's a much bigger problem is that all the other agreements are under threat, and the European Union is forcing Switzerland to sign a global institutional agreement before the end of this year, which would, on 5 or 6 major issues, allow European law to be, or force European law to be integrated into Swiss law. And that, of course, brings back all the resistance of the primitive canton against, foreign judges and so on. And so there is a certain allergy in the country to any kind of agreement like that. The government is for this agreement, has been able to get the fact that there will be arbitrators, 3 arbitrators, and we will therefore not depend directly on Brussels on these 5 agreements. but nevertheless, the economic organizations, the right, moderate right parties, are also in favor of signing this agreement before the end of the year. But the government does not dare to put it as a law, because if the parliament votes this law, there will be a referendum, and we'll never get it through by the end of this year. And there's a big risk that the Swiss population, like the British, would vote against it, and that would be an absolute disaster for Switzerland. So I think Brexit also has really been the reason for this critical situation with Europe, because Europe has had to, the British tried in the first place to get the same status as Switzerland. Boris Johnson, the former mayor of London and a minister also, said that he wanted to create a Brexerland, which was a Switzerland-English situation, also based on bilateral agreements. The EU said no, and in fact said that bilateral was dead and there would be no more bilateral agreements. So that has put the Swiss system completely under pressure, and that's why we have until the end of the year to comply. I'll jump to this, but you have to understand this challenge of our relation with Europe, which is absolutely crucial. And the fact that the British situation is looked at very, very, very closely. And of course, the big problem today, as I said before, this government of 7 people representing four parties have become much more polarized between the left and the right. And therefore, the consensus of the government has been a little bit under pressure. It's no more a government which we used to have even 10 years ago. It's become much more sort of less consensual, and that's very crucial for a country like Switzerland, where its success has been based on the stability of our institutions. But I'm an optimistic, and that's how I would like to stop with that subject, and I'm confident, in fact, that we'll find a modus vivendi with the EU before the end of the year, hopefully by signing this institutional agreement. In fact, Switzerland has a B plan. It's been signing a few weeks ago a major agreement with China, where every trade barrier of services and goods has been lifted between the two countries, and with Japan also, and with Canada. So you see that obviously if we can't get along with Europe, we'll have to try to find a global compensation. I doubt that this will be possible when you look at the geographical situation and this little tiny country of 8 million people. Now, of course, the Swiss have been always very open to world trade, and Geneva, in fact, is especially open to world trade, but was very, not world trade, but world openness, I would say. Since the Reformation, Geneva has always had 50% of its population foreigners and 50% Swiss, and not even Genevois. So that is something quite unique in the sense that this has been also the reason for Geneva being poor until the 1920s and becoming quite rich after the Second World War, when services developed and sort of multinationals started coming to Geneva and the financial sector developing itself. You have to know that Switzerland is, of course, a private economy, has a very strong private economy versus the public sector, has very large companies. We are the country in the world that has the largest number of multinationals. Among the Fortune 500 largest companies, we have 15 of them. Germany, with a population 10 times bigger than ours, has only 38 or 39, and the US has only 40, with a population of 30 times bigger than Switzerland. So we have a large number of the big multinationals. Obviously, you know, Nestle, you know, Rolex, you know, Novartis or Roche, and so on. But there are some that you've never heard of, but that are extremely strong and that are reasonably unknown to the general public. The thing is that Geneva, not only, or Switzerland, but Geneva in particular, has not only those multinationals working in the whole world, but has also the multinationals from other countries. We have 150 out of the 500 Fortune companies having their European headquarters in Switzerland, and most of them in Geneva. There you see again the big challenge we are facing, because if Switzerland loses its status vis-à-vis Europe, this will bring the multinationals to leave Switzerland, or at least to reconsider. It was not for tax reasons. The people working in the multinationals in Switzerland pay full taxes. Companies, one must admit, pay less taxes than the Swiss companies. They have tax agreements which are going to be now, in the next few months, put at the same rate. The tax rate will be 13.99, 14%. But it's not for taxation, it's, I think, for stability of the country, and it's a good location also to be exactly between Asia and the Americas. You can deal with the two parts of the world during the same day, which the Americans cannot do and the Asians cannot do. And of course it was a good center for being in Europe and dealing with the European countries. That's the big problem today. Now coming to the last part of my presentation, I'm sorry to have been too long. Some companies have become multinationals, some have stayed private. This is the case of Picte and Company, which has 210 years of history, and as it was said in the presentation, I was a senior managing partner. You become automatically at the end of your career, but it's primus inter pares, because everybody, the 7 partners usually of the bank are equal. I was partner during 28 years in managing partner of the bank. Now, the bank was created 10 years before Geneva joined Switzerland, so it was not even a Swiss bank at the very beginning. But you must realize, obviously, that it remained very small until the Second World War. I mean, there were maybe 100 employees at Picte at the end of Second World War. My father was in the mountains. He was a partner of the bank. He was leading the bank from a chalet in the mountains, which had a huge underground, which had been sort of secretly created, where most of the securities and the gold reserves of our clients were held, which would not have been, therefore, maybe seen immediately if the Germans, or afterwards if the Russians, because in fact you must realize that just after the Second World War, the biggest threat perceived in Switzerland, but not only in Switzerland, was that the Russians would invade us, and therefore all the banks had huge protective places. You know that there was in the Alps a reserve which could host 800,000 people, with factories to produce every necessary good, with a complete system against any weapons, chemist weapons and so on. They had sort of pumps to pump oxygen, clean oxygen, fresh water reserves for 3 months or 6 months. And we still have those huge caverns in the mountains, which are, you cannot imagine, it's a city maybe the size of St. Petersburg in the Alps, where the entries are just little doors that look like just a little entry into a little place, or a little chalet or anything like that, and that is there are about 20 entrances to this central place which could host 800,000 people. And that was kept secret. I mean, I've never seen this place, and it's closed now, and it's remained secret for a long time. It was hardly guarded by guns which could come out of the mountain and protect the country. Now, how do you stay a private company during 8th generation? Just to tell you something, if you're incorporated, obviously you have shares, and the shares go to the next generation and so on. It's diluted between the families, and you lose control after a certain time. Picte is a partnership, and therefore, and it's only the managing partners, the ones that are spending 12 hours a day or more in the office or elsewhere, but working, who are the owners of the bank. So in fact, since I've left 8 years ago, I have 0% in the bank. And that is, in fact, the key of the success of the bank, is that it is owned by its managers. Now, a partnership, in fact, as I said, the prerequisite is that it has no shares, and that the partners are co-opted, and they are given a certain percentage of the profit of the bank, and they have to put up a certain percentage of the capital of the bank. The cooptation, and of course one of the features of the private banks and of Picte is that you have unlimited liability on your personal wealth for the liabilities of the bank. That's the feature of partnerships. And for those who have the name Picte, because there are partners who are not Pictes, we have another 5 years after retirement where you're fully liable with your total fortune on any liability of the bank. That, of course, has created a situation where the private banks retreated on asset management strictly, no investment banking, no commercial banking, because of the risks involved with the other activities. And that, of course, has kept the bank going. When I started, in fact, the bank was managing 10 billion Swiss francs, $10 billion, because now it's 1-to-1 dollar Swiss franc. Today we are managing 500 billion. So this is about 3/4 of the GDP of Switzerland. So it's quite a big growth, as you can see. The 80s have been extremely strong. The bank has grown. We were 300 when I joined. They are, I have to say they because I'm no more there, 4,500 today. but strictly always half institutional, half pension funds and foundations and so on, and half private banking. That is the only thing that is done. Now, how do you pick the partners? That's the secret, I think, of our success. First of all, the family partners have never been more than half of the existing partners. We always have, throughout the ages, I think since maybe not the first years in 1850, in 1805, but soon already in the beginning of the 20th century, half of the partners were coming from the outside. So the fact of taking talents as such as partners was crucial to the success of Picte, and some of the most talented or successful bankers that made the bank grow were not members of the family. I must admit that, and that's something very important. Today, in fact, with a bank of $500 billion under management, you need even more skills. The family only represents 1/3 of the partners. Now, how are and the 2/3, 1/3 is made out of partners coming from, that's only 2 in fact, coming from the inside as a promotion, the best sort of directors that we have in the firm and so on can emerge as partners, and 2 come from the outside, bringing new experiences, new knowledge that we don't have within the bank. And the family keeps about 1/3 of the partnership. The family has this is not on paper. You'll be surprised to know that the charter of Picte is on 1 page, A4. Everything that I'm telling you is oral, is transmitted orally from one sort of generation to the other, and there is absolutely nothing on paper. The Picte family partners have a slight preference vote to select the non-Picte partners, to co-opt them. And the non-Picte partners have a small advantage in co-opting the Picte partners. Therefore, they will not choose your son or your daughter. They will choose whoever in the family has the best background and is the best suited to represent your family. I have 3 children, none of them is in the bank. So I can tell you that on my side, although I have cousins that are also the 8th generation, it doesn't matter, but I have 3 children. One is a lawyer, has a doctorate degree in law, PhD in law. The other one is a physics engineer, and the third one is a psychologist. So you see, he studied law and economics in St. Gallen like I did, but he didn't like it, and he made a doctorate degree in Oxford in psychology, and is a very happy man today in his 40s. So in fact, I'm very happy to have 3 children. I was very disappointed, I must tell you, at some point. But in fact, today they have chosen their own ambitious career, and they're doing what they like. And in fact, our system of cooptation allows their children, for instance, if they are studying economics or they are good, etc., to be as well protected of being chosen as partners in the next generation compared to those of the family that are today partners. Because your children have absolutely no right. When you leave with 0% in the bank, therefore you have nothing to say. And you cannot have your own child at the same time as you in the bank. So you have absolutely nothing to say in the cooptation. Now, another feature, and that's the last one I will tell you, obviously we have, the partners are also co-opted on the basis of their age. There are 2 partners in their 30s, 2 partners in their 40s, 2 partners in their 50s, and 1 or 2 partners in their 60 to 65. Now, how do you take partners from the outside? Obviously, we have a very large capital. Managing $500 billion requires a capital ratio which is quite high. No partner is bringing any money personally into the bank, which means that whether he's wealthy or not makes absolutely no difference. He has to borrow 100% from the partnership. And as he grows, takes with the profits that he's making with his percentage that is growing every year, during the first 15 years of his partnership, he will grow his position and he will sort of be indebted to the other partners, which makes the younger partners a little bit more humble compared to the older partners, because they owe them money. And then when they, after 15 years, that's on average I would say, they start lending, of course, to the younger partners that are coming up. So when you end up at 65, you are almost down to zero, and therefore the transition from being the senior managing partner and being nobody anymore the next day is extremely soft in terms of financial. And in fact, the only wealth that you take out of the bank is what you have earned yourself. You don't take any goodwill. The goodwill is at 1 franc in the bank. So you see that this system is a very reasonable one. It's still working in spite of the fact that we have now more than 4,000 people, and there's no reason why it should not continue. That I think is the story of the family. 2 anecdotes on the family again. As I told you, we were extremely poor. Picte is the oldest family in Geneva. We were in Geneva in the 13th century already. In fact, from 1474 to be exact, until 1815, we always had 1 or 2 members in the local government. So it was a sort of, it was not a democracy, it was a sort of privileged type of oligarchy, if you like, ruling Geneva, which was an independent city. Geneva always was independent, not protected by France against Savoy, but always remained. You know that in Europe you had, in Italy you had Florence, you had lots, Siena and so on, lots of cities that were totally independent, Venice and so on. In Germany you also had cities which were independent. In Switzerland also, Geneva was an independent city under the Roman Empire, sort of, they had a bishop which was not allowed to live in the canton. He was outside, but he was in fact the ruler legally. But the country was totally autonomous, and in fact, that's I don't know why I've said that.
No, you started with Geneva being an independent city because one of your predecessors entered something in 1474.
Entered the
1474. The Picte were in Geneva since 13th century, but to tell you end of 15th century something happened.
Exactly. So in fact, and in fact, in a family, you had obviously a few boys. The first boy in the family since, let's say, the 16th century was the one that was a mercenary. Because that was the sort of clearest way to get an income for the whole family. So all my ancestors from the 16th century were mercenaries, especially to the King of France. We had a battalion, in fact, in the 17th century, which was the Picte battalion, which was all made out of mercenaries, and which received quite a lot of money from the French. But when the French were fighting the Austrians, there were as many Swiss mercenaries on the Austrian side as on the French side. So very often the Swiss were sort of fighting against each other. The first one was a mercenary. The second one was a clergyman. After the Reformation, we almost always had a clergyman among brothers. And the last one, if there was only 3 sons, would go to Russia, because Russia was the promised land, in fact, like Australia or like South Africa was for other countries. There was only one country which was promising for the most adventurous member of the family to make a large fortune was Russia. So the story of the Pictes in Russia has about 15 or 20 anecdotes of those members of the family that came to Russia. Most of them were not successful. I would say almost all of them were not successful. Maybe the 2 that were the most successful was Picte le Géant. He was 2 meters high, and he was very close to Orlov, who was very close to Catherine the Great. As you can imagine, Picte le Géant also became quite close to her, apparently, but she had a lot of secretaries. He was, in fact, his French coordinator with the French Siècle des Lumières, with Diderot, with Voltaire. Catherine had great relations with Diderot and Voltaire, and this Picte, in fact, was keeping the correspondence and keeping the relation during 15 years alongside Catherine Grande. The other anecdote was in 1815, as I told you. Charles Picte was the head of the delegation, and Tsar Alexander was one of the key issue in bringing Swiss neutrality through this relationship. But there again, if it happened, it's because Charles Picte's son, who was 18 or 19 years old, had, the Genevois, but everywhere in Europe, people were scientists. They had a lot of interest, and agronomy was one of the big interests of some of my family. And Charles Picte, the father, who had served the King of France as a mercenary, came back at the age of 36 or 37. He had a son who was 16, 17, and the father grew some sheep, Merinos sheep, in Geneva. And they wrote articles in a big sort of magazine which was sent to all the courts in Europe, which was called the Bibliothèque Britannique, which was created by Charles Picte, on these Merinos sheep. In fact, the Duke of Richelieu in Crimea learned about those, was reading those reviews every 3 months or something like that. And he saw these sheep, and he thought it would be a good idea to try to make production in Russia. So Charles Picte sent his 18-year-old boy with 800 sheep to Odessa, and I think only about half of them arrived safely. And the trip lasted very long, as you can imagine, at that time. That was in 1812 or 1813. And in fact, today you still have near Odessa a place called Novo Lancy. Lancy is the name of the property which Charles Picte was living in Geneva. So Novorossiysk still exists in Crimea, and those sheep became quite good. In fact, the chapelle was 20,000 heads at some point, and then came a big cholera disease, and I think the war, of course, there was the big fire in Moscow, and people were also starving, and so the sheep were killed in great part either by illness or by because one needed food in the country, and that's how they disappeared. So that's the end of the story. I'm sorry I've been sort of going from one to the other like this, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Okay, well, I'm happy to take questions. Of course, I would like just to make the initial comments while people think about those questions, and I think you really raised the national pride of Russians listening to you. Of course, we never knew that we guaranteed the neutrality of Switzerland. Of course, we did it as many other good things to the world, but we forgot it. Then another thing which really surprised me is, of course, you said that initially the Swiss lived off the passage through the Alps, right? And of course, nobody could pass without paying them, or at least we know one guy who did. His name was Suvorov. Though, of course, at a horrible price, as we know. And the third vignette also is about...
You know that 200 years before our age, Hannibal went with elephants through the Alps to defeat, to take Rome and to defeat. So he went from Tunis to Spain and then right through the Alps, and nobody was expecting him to succeed.
So we see,
the Alps played a major role.
Yeah. And the third vignette is what you said about you being right now a very important taxpayer for your canton and for your commune, meaning for your township, right? Because we just finished as a university a study of Russian municipalities, which is a creation of big data base. And of course, they know they don't have any taxing power. So what you started with, saying that is Swiss model repeatable, I would say, of course, not, because of what we know from Russian municipalities, they ask for regional and federal money to be sent back to them. So in a sense, when I look at what you've been describing, of course, I was just wondering that no comparative project on Russian and Swiss municipal life is possible right now. On the other hand, of course, there are other questions.
But I'm just going to add something which I didn't tell you. Our Calvinistic education means that even in the bank today, the partners have an extremely low profile. I mean, we have no chauffeurs, we have no cars, we have no bodyguards. I don't have any servants at home. We have a very we have an extremely sort of modest way of, or non-flashy way, if you like, of living, and that's extremely important. I mean, when we take new partners, the big test is to go sailing, for those who like sailing, during 1 week with the potential partner, and we take his wife also, because the wife is extremely important. I mean, if the wife is against the husband, or if she's against the fact that he's going to work very hard and he's going to be away a long time, all the time, or if she's too flashy or too whatever, on a boat you cannot cheat. On a sailing boat, you hear everything from one cabin to the other, and when you have to pull the ropes yourself, but no, this factor of low profile is extremely important, and that's a big difference with Zurich. In fact, the financial sector in Zurich, you will see, you know, the sort of big bankers playing major roles. In Geneva, you don't see them. we are staying extremely sort of cautious of remaining that way, living in a very simple way, as much as we can, obviously.
Okay. Well, Director Vadim Volkov, please.
The real power is invisible. Actually, I have two questions. Very different questions, but first I would like to make a comment that leads me to the question. I was really delighted by the way you framed the Swiss history, putting the military capacity and the coercion, the mercenaries, the military power in the beginning. So yes, of course, Swiss mercenaries and the Swiss military skill played a major role in European history of state building. But the mercenaries, as you emphasize, they didn't have much of the agricultural lands, because the big European state had huge agricultural lands, and Switzerland, or future Switzerland, did not have that. They only had the military power and military skills. Therefore, the political regime, so to speak, or the political arrangement in such a community would be properly called a warrior democracy. We know this, not the republic, but the warrior democracy like Athens, or like maybe the mountain Chechnya in the especially in the 19th century, where all men who wear weapons, swords, they are free and equal. So there's no hierarchy, and because they are, they respect each other and they depend upon each other in combat, they built a very high trust type of military or of a political community. Now the question is, having this capital, which depends upon the military skill and widely recognized military skill, and a military democracy based on trust, how to capitalize on that? Then you mentioned that still Switzerland was poor, or the cantons, they were poor for a very long time. Then they became neutral. But the heyday of capitalization of this type of asset, which is mountain region, very intensive military history and self-conscious military community, it came in the period between the two world wars. And what is the period between the two world wars? Is when the whole world swings left. The states become strong, the Great Depression onsets in Europe and United States, taxes go up, and states become more important than holders of capital, the private capital. So what does Switzerland and Liechtenstein and Luxembourg, what did they do? They capitalize on secrecy and no taxes, just servicing, bank accounts and companies. So they become the heaven for capital that flees from the state power, in fascist Germany, or the New Deal in United States, where the taxes go up. So, and then the new history of Switzerland becomes. This is the moment where the military power, the military sort of the coercion gets capitalized and transforms into huge financial power, capitalizing on this global development between the two world wars. Then there's the second wave, when the conservative wave of the 1980s, and we should probably mention the word offshore sector, right? Which you didn't mention, but Switzerland and
but the markets picked up also very much.
Switzerland and Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, they developed a very interesting business model. Then there was the Caribbean offshore zone, and then the 1990s, the neoliberal wave, which also drew a lot of capital into this sector. But then the pendulum swung back. The states strike back again when, after the crisis of the 2008, offshores and Switzerland as well, and Swiss banks had to sign agreements with OECD, disclosing upon request of financial authorities, the owners of assets, etc. And they were under pressure because the rest of the world could cut financial transactions to, financial sector of what they consider the offshore zone, and this was a very strong leverage. So my first question is, do you feel the consequences? Because your family is very, eight generations and more, 8 generations of the company and many more generations. So you think, I'm sure you think globally. I mean, you have your, the global history on your fingertips. So do you really feel that the structure of global economic relations changes after, say, 2008, and that the states, like, shall we call them normal states, or like, the European states, United States, other states, that they go against they try to fight with the secrecy of the banking sector or the financial sector? Do you feel threatened? Do you feel under pressure from the, state elites of other countries going against, the tax havens and the secrecy regimes? That's the first question. But then, if you allow, after that, I will ask another question.
Well, I was chairman of the Financial Center of Geneva during 2000 to 2010, so I lived through the 2008 delivery of the list of American clients of UBS to the US, and I can tell you that obviously I was one of the most outspoken anti-US regulatory sort of pressure, trying to protect something which we thought was justified. I mean, I have never felt guilty myself of knowing that, as I told you before, we have about half of our funds are private funds and the other half are institutional. In the private funds, there was at one time, today it's 100% declared because of the new agreements that have been made. But before, it used to be more than half of the private funds were probably undeclared, and you were almost, the French, for instance, their currency was devaluating by 10-15% a year. So every French family that had some kind of wealth had to have a little part, la poire pour la soif, as we call it in French, the pierre for the thirst, had to have something in Switzerland, and people who did not have something in Switzerland were considered as stupid in France. I mean, it was, that the transfer of fund was made through compensation. In fact, in the Figaro, you had every day the official rate, Swiss franc, French franc, and the official rate of compensation, which was the rate of tax evasion, in fact, which was officially stated every day. It was in the normal attitude at that time. First of all, obviously, in the 1930s, when the banking secrecy was introduced, it was to protect the Jews who were persecuted by the Germans. But afterwards, it became a sort of religion in Switzerland of privacy, of sovereignty, of privacy, of Big Brother not looking over your shoulder, and so on and so on. People were responsible. Obviously, this does not mean accepting money from any sort of source. There was an extreme, we have never had any, and that has made the reputation of the bank, that's how we've grown. we've never been caught in any big scandal of money laundering or anything like that. So the due diligence of where the money was coming from was done with great care always throughout the whole history that I know, at least, of Picte. But the fact of asking a client, are you declaring your full income or your full wealth to your government, it was none of our business. I mean, it's like if you're asking, the hotel to check also whether your money has been declared. Obviously, it's an exaggeration, but it was not. It's people's sort of ethics that are supposed to be involved in being honest with their tax authorities or not, and it's the responsibility of countries to have tax systems which are acceptable or not. I mean, in Sweden, in the years 1960, 1970, there was a socialist government with Prime Minister Erlander, who was there, and wealthy people were paying more than 100% on their income in taxes. If you take the Wallenberg family, which is still extremely powerful in Sweden, what did Axel and his wife Alice do? They created a big foundation called the Axel and Alice Foundation, where they put all their holdings in Ericsson, in Atlas Copco, in all the companies that they own. They owned maybe a tenth of the Swedish economy. They put all the shares in this foundation. All the benefits of those shares, the dividends and so on, went to charities, which meant that the foundation was exempted from taxes. But of course, as they held big positions in companies, the statutes of the foundation said that the family members were representing the companies in their boards. And therefore, all the generations afterwards, Marcus, Mark, the current Marcus and his cousin and so on, we are very close to them. They all trained at Picte during their career. I think 5 generations of Wallenbergs spent at least 1 year at Picte in the beginning of their career, and I went also 1 year in Sweden to work at Enskilda Bank that time. But that was the way that they saved. They got, of course, representation fees being on the board of big companies in Sweden, but they held nothing more from the foundations. And the foundation survived. That was the only way, in fact. So countries, again, were also responsible for pushing people out or finding solutions like foundations and so on to save one's wealth. It was the only way. And I've really never felt guilty about that, thinking that it was maybe not ideal. I mean, I wouldn't think of doing that myself, but we accepted that as being part of privacy and people's problem and not our problem. Now, obviously, when the US started attacking, that was because of the 2008 debacle of the banking industry in the US, and that, of course, the US was responsible for this crisis at the very beginning with their polluted derivatives and so on, and that, of course, created a complete sort of government sort of hand put on the financial system, because they have to save the banks that were too big to fail, and so on and so on. And our banking secrecy was then totally defeated, as I said, to date. So today, in fact, retrospectively, the partners who took over after me in 2010 have had to change completely their mindset. And today, of course, tax evasion is considered as a sin. It was considered as something at that time which was normal to keep wealth sort of protected in a certain way. Now the viewpoint has changed completely. I think there's been a very big change in the perception. I think this wave is going to increase even more. That the discrepancies between the very rich and the very poor is increasing very much, even in Switzerland, and that is creating a situation which will be explosive one day or the other. That is probably my biggest worry, is the sort of gap that is widening, of course. Now, obviously we're going through in Switzerland the third big revolution which every country is facing, but which we are facing more because we have a service industry which is about 2/3 of our economy, and that's of course very strong. The first revolution was of course the agricultural revolution, when they had the first tractor and the farmers had to leave to the cities. The second one was machines, when you'd see Charlie Chaplin in his film when he was kicked out of the U.S. as a communist because he was defending the working class who was in factories and so on. But you had this sort of automation of industry, and today you have the learning machines and the artificial intelligence, blockchain, which is going to totally revolutionize the service industry. Service industry is the most threatened part of the economy by the new technologies, that's for sure. So I think now whether we are going to be able to cope with this, it's for Switzerland it's very important because of the 8% of GDP representing the financial sector, but it's the same phenomenon everywhere. I'm not sure I answered your question again, but
you did.
I did.
You did very well. So maybe you take other questions.
Yeah, because we might be running out of time. So, okay, Evgeny.
Thank you for your very fascinating talk. I would like to ask you about very simple things. The first one is the referendum system. Critiques of the referendum system would normally say rank and file citizens never have time to examine a question from a pro and contra perspective. At least they would never have the same opportunity as professional politicians would to examine the question. And particularly when you have to vote, like you said, 16 or 20 times per year, that means you basically vote intuitively, right? And that opens up the system to misinformation, manipulation, the deadly consequences of this you can see in the referendum over record, right? So the critics would expect you to find your country in disarray, confused, and perhaps performing poorly in economy and democracy. It is the opposite. So what's the trick? And the second one is that Geneva and Switzerland, I think as a whole, are considered in Geneva, I would think, as the capital of internationalism. In the interwar period, it was the host of the League of Nations. Now it is the host of the United Nations headquarters. When I was there, it looked like everyone was, a little international, and it is, I guess, taken as nations' pride. And I wonder how does that combine with ultra-nationalist developments, both in Switzerland and outside?
The fact that Switzerland is considered as a central government, I think, taking Geneva for instance, more than Switzerland, Geneva is really today the center of, it's the only city in the world where you have the synergies and and you have the critical mass of international organizations dealing with the world's big challenges of the future. I mean, whether it's we have 40 international organizations. We have, of course, the UN in Geneva, which is twice as big as New York. We have more than 30,000 people work at the UN in Geneva. You have all the important agencies. Now, our big challenge today is to create the governance of the future in Geneva, and that is, I think, the government has created a foundation 3 weeks ago, in fact, which will be headed by Patrick Ebicher, the former dean of the institute in Lausanne, the Polytechnicum Institute in Lausanne. He's an extremely bright person, and he's going to try to imagine how to especially address the question of numerization, of blockchain, of international cyber security, which is one of the big problems, and artificial intelligence. All this has to be ruled. It cannot be ruled probably by hard laws. It has to be ruled by soft laws. And Geneva is the world center of soft laws. Soft laws, you know, is something that comes from soft power of Joseph Nye in the United States. Geneva has all the agencies, all the capabilities, and the legitimacy. We have 170 embassies in Geneva, not on a bilateral but on a multilateral basis. So we are the capital of multilateralism, which is in big danger today, of course, with the current situation, but which in 2 or 3 years, when Mr. Trump will be away and when others will also change maybe, which I think we will come back, it's a pendulum, we'll come back to sort of multilateral diplomacy and the virtues of multilateralism. Now we have, our big challenge now is to keep in Geneva the governance bodies of each of these new themes, you know, the genome, the human genome, for instance, being used abusively. Cyber security is an extremely important thing. We are ruling already in Geneva through 3 different organizations the internet. You know, internet was discovered in Geneva at the CERN by Bernice Lee, and in fact it's absolutely logical that internet would be ruled out of Geneva. The Americans have got rid of the Internet Society, which was one of the ruling body, because they don't want to hurt their sort of IT industry, of course. So in fact it's a hot potato which everybody is trying to get rid of, and we are trying to take it. So maybe there we have a big potential to bring something to the to globalization and but also to ruling of some of the global issues. Now, your first question about direct democracy and referendums being threatened by the fact that we are voting too many times a year on too many issues, and today you're facing fake news and so on. I don't think that has great importance, because you know, fake news are harmful also if you have a non-direct democracy system without any referendums and so on. I mean, fake news are very used in elections, as you know, and in very large countries, and therefore I don't think it's going to be harmful. I think on the contrary, in the fact that we are voting on so many issues, it makes fake news almost impossible to really sort of distort the opinion. And referendums, by definition, people don't really understand very often the issue behind them, so they vote no. By definition, referendums are refused. Initiatives are even more refused. There's been, in the whole history of Switzerland, 220 initiatives. There's been thousands of referendums, but 220, only 20 have been accepted. Unfortunately, this last one of 2014, which is of course the big blow up of probably of our system, at least our relation with Europe. So I'm not sure that technology is going to make our system obsolete. I think obviously the fact that 2.5 billion people have access to the internet is important per se, but it's not more important in Switzerland than in any other country. I don't think so.
Okay, we'll have space for a couple of more questions before 8 p.m. Okay.
Thank you for your candid talk, and I would like to use this opportunity to thank your family and institution for your charitable donation to the Graduate Institute, because I did my PhD there, and it so happens that...
Yes, you are the person I heard from you, in fact.
And but my question relates back to your reflection on the soft power of Switzerland, because I've observed this soft power many times when I was in Switzerland. And how does one project soft power when there are financial constraints? If I reframe my question, here at the European University, we believe that our mission, I wouldn't say mission, but one of our tasks is to project Russian soft power inside Russia and outside. The so peaceful power of enlightenment and bringing knowledge to the community. And I was wondering, when there are financial resources and when there is ability and accumulated wealth to do so through higher education institutions, it is easy, but it is a daunting task when you are a small institution in a quite big country. So I was wondering, what is your reflection on the soft power in Switzerland, and how did Switzerland become so good at this, absent of the financial ability of the country?
Well, I think it's not because Switzerland is a small country that it cannot be the sort of headquarters of soft power. On the contrary, I think the actors of soft power are all the countries that are present in Switzerland, in the international organizations, with the ONGs, the NGOs, with the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum has 900 people, all of extremely high education, who are working on all the topics, and not the ones of next year and the year after, but the one in 10 years' time. They are, you cannot imagine the depth of... I was on the board of the WEF during 8 years, so I've seen how it functions. It has access to the greatest group of professors in every single discipline in the world that meets in Dubai and Abu Dhabi alternatively every year. About 700 professors from the whole world meet there, invited by Dubai, which costs them $10 million for a 5-day vacation for those professors. So the Chinese can meet the Russian, can meet the German or the French, and so on and so on. And in fact, Klaus Schwab takes his ideas from in terms of planning what the subject of Davos and the other symposium of the World Economic Forum are going to be, from those sort of professors who are asked to go into groups. I mean, a doctor will, sort of professor in medicine will be in the same group as an architect or whatever, and he creates sort of multidisciplinary groups, which are fantastic. But this is just to say that we have not only the World Economic Forum, but we have those international organizations which can work together. And you know, the big problem with world governance or is that everything works in silo, in sort of a closed circle. In Geneva, the head of the WHO can sort of call up in the morning and have lunch with the head of the World Trade Organization and so on. There has not been many spectacular results of soft power succeeding in Geneva, but you can say, for instance, that Gavi, which is this organization giving 700 million vaccines per year in the world, is completely made out of intellectual property rights being lifted, world trade rules being lifted also, money from the private sector, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, but also 80% from the governments being put into a fund, and a global agreement being taken on one issue. Vaccine is only one small example, but I think in terms of regulating internet, for instance, or the sort of artificial intelligence and the learning machines and so on, so that they remain under human control in a certain way. That can be at least discussed, and some sort of conclusions and some recommendations can be made without them being necessarily adopted. But I think every country realizes the problems. China is closing down a lot of its internet accesses and so on. I think everybody realizes the threats, and I think they're going to realize it more and more as technology is taking a sort of turn in a way that in 2 years' time we will probably not think of any of the problems that we are facing today, and we will have a completely new range of much greater problems related to technology. So I think this technological revolution that we're going through now has the best chance to be ruled by soft power. Now, how that's going to be sort of presented by those think tanks which are being created. We have already 12 hubs in Geneva, one on human rights, one on water, one on where all the different constituencies meet and try to fix some limits and some red lines and so on and so on. I think we have a good chance to take a big share of that, and we are the ideal country where we have no direct interest in being, but we can only offer those kind of services which can only be soft. I think soft power will take over after this period of, on the contrary, governments becoming more and more intrusive into every segment of our lives. I think when the pendulum moves, we'll go back not only into sort of multilateral diplomacy, but also into sort of solutions made out of consensus. But that's wishful thinking, you might say.
Okay, we usually finish at 8, but today, given the interest, I see, and I still didn't even ask one question from that side. So if that side wants to ask a question, we'll give them the opportunity.
can I ask a question? I just wanted Mr. Picte to elaborate briefly on this decision, this referendum decision in 2014, what kind of rights by EU citizens did it restrict? Did it come into force already? Did it restrict their employment rights, their resettlement rights? Just tell a little bit more about it.
I'm sorry, I have a very bad ear, so could you just, I understood not 100%.
And introduce
My name is Ivana and I'm a civil activist. I just heard about the announcement that came on here. I wanted you, Mr. Picte, to elaborate on the 2014 referendum decision on the restriction of EU citizens' rights. What rights did it affect, did it come into force, and how is it planned for it to be enforced if it comes, even if it comes a law?
Okay, I think the most important bilateral agreement and the most important issue with Brexit, for instance, today, for a country leaving the EU, is free movement of people. Obviously, it comes from the fact that the European Union does not want to be sort of accepting hundreds of thousands of refugees every year and not being able to count on countries like Switzerland, although we do have our share of refugees in Switzerland, but but they don't want to see other countries closing their borders, like Poland, like Hungary, like Sweden, and so on and so on. So there is a tendency for the EU countries themselves to resist and to want to change the rules from Brussels, but Brussels does not want and cannot change the rules. So when Switzerland voted to contradict its bilateral agreement on the free movement of people within the European Union and Switzerland, this was almost a casus belli between Switzerland and the European Union, and that was the beginning of, because there is a clause in those 100 bilateral agreements we have with the EU, is that if one of the major ones, I think there is about a dozen major ones, is not respected by Switzerland, there is a guillotine situation where all the others fall at the same time. The EU is allowed to cancel all the other bilateral agreements. So in fact, by voting by 50.3% in 2014, we almost let the EU trigger a complete sort of ban of all our bilateral agreements, which they didn't do because obviously they have first of all 400,000 people working in Switzerland. They have a trade surplus of 40 billion Swiss francs with Switzerland. So the European Union has a lot of advantages of having a Swiss ally, but they cannot, by principle, change this rule of free movement, and therefore this, as I said again, is this referendum has really been probably the worst decision by the population that has ever been taken. I mean, in 1990 we already voted to go against, not to enter what Norway is in. What is it called? This other sort of alliance, but there's only one country into it now, plus Liechtenstein, yes, Liechtenstein and Norway, which had a special deal with the EU. We refused to enter that. That was already a very dark day for Switzerland, but there breaching one of the main treaties with the EU in 2014 was a real big blow.
So this decision has not come into force yet. It has not become law.
It has, but I mean it's like 2016, the Brexit. They declared the Article 50 in 2017, and it's only taking place in March 2019. It will probably be postponed a bit. So there's always a sort of time lag where negotiations are taking place. In the first period of 2014 to 16, the European Union was quite open to negotiating with Switzerland, understanding that our system of referendum, it's not the fault of the government. The government was strongly against, of course, and therefore, but it has to say to, when it negotiates, the government, the Swiss government, is in an impossible situation because they have to say to their counterpart, we agree, we're ready to sign, but you know very well that we have to have acceptance by the parliament, and then you can have a referendum by the population. Therefore, we cannot guarantee that we can keep our word. This is a very difficult situation to be in a position to negotiate. And today we are in a very difficult situation to negotiate. If we don't sign this agreement where we will have to take over part of the EU legislation.
Then it
Excuse me, we just have to stop fighting because
Okay, Jack, I just wanted to
This is the
does
first question.
Switzerland have to quit the Schengen agreement?
No, it's not yet to that. We're not yet in the sanction period. We have until the end of the year to vote this institutional agreement, and afterwards Europe will have seen what the Brexit has, where the Brexit is. Probably it's going to be very dependent on that. We'll see whether the European Union makes further concessions or not. But the government today, which has negotiated this institutional agreement with the EU, so in full agreement, does not dare to put it in front of Parliament, because if Parliament votes in favour, which we are in favour, the population, there will be a referendum by the extreme right, and the population might say again no. And then we're in big trouble because, and first of all, voting a referendum, which I didn't tell you, takes about a year and a half. It could be an urgent matter voted before the end of the year. It would be probably. If the government dares to vote the law, allowing the government to sign this agreement.
let us hope that actually the example of Brexit will finally produce a good movement on the Swiss-European relationship, because we're all expecting on the 29th of March that for the first time Eurostar trains will not be running, because the French border guards will not be stamping enough visas in the English passports, and the line will be a mile and a half. That's what Financial Times is running. So hopefully that will be a good example for the Swiss to reconsider. But let us thank you for this sweeping overview of Swiss history, which is simultaneously very personally related and is presented to us with a good sense of humor, and as also is keeping us thinking that Russia has to contribute something to debates like that, because we did it in the past, we should do it in the future. Thank you so much for coming.